Good evening and welcome to the Rules Committee. Before we get started, I believe that the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts has a unanimous consent request that we want to entertain first.
Well, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to appoint the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Torres, to the Subcommittee on Rules and Organization of the House to rank immediately under myself.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you very much. We're delighted to have completed that. And Ms. Torres, congratulations. It's now official.
We'll change the stationery.
Good evening and welcome back to the Rules Committee. Today the committee will consider H.R. 3798, Save American Workers Act of 2018. H.R. 3798 would give employers and workers more flexibility by changing the Affordable Care Act's definition of full-time worker from 30 hours per work week to 40 hours per work week, and from 120 hours per month to 174 hours per month for full-time equivalents. In addition, the bill gives employers retroactive relief from the employee or mandate penalty. The bill delays the ACA's excise tax on high-cost health care plans until 2023, which is good news in particular for people from Butler, PA, who might be members of a union. Finally, in light of this repeal of the individual mandate penalty, H.R. 3798 removes an unnecessary requirement that certain providers of minimum essential coverage send statements to individuals regarding their health coverage, and instead requires that these statements be made available to individuals upon request. Common sense. This bill will help American families by allowing employees to work more than 30 hours per week and avoid the dramatic reduction in salary that so many people across the country are beginning to see. So, we're delighted that we have Mr. Levin back and the distinguished gentleman from Butler, Pennsylvania, the gentleman who I call Mike O'Kelly. I know his name is Kelly, but brings out the distinguished Irish in the gentleman since he played at Notre Dame. We're delighted that you're here. Before we get to you, I want to move to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts for any words that he would like to offer this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin, I just have a very few comments, but I want to acknowledge two of my constituents who are here from Massachusetts, from Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, Christine and Charles Eppinger. And so we want to welcome them to the committee. And so I have to be on my best behavior. So I'm going to.
Well, Christine, Charles, that won't be bad. You're nice. Oh, all right. Well, I think it's a normal procedure. So big grin and smile there.
So yeah. So anyway, but as I said, I don't have a lot to say here today because I think the American people want us to be focused on expanding health care protections in the health care law and strengthening our health care system. And I think this bill does the opposite. You know, it's part of this Republican pastime around here to sabotage people's health care. And it's not just this. I mean, we see attempts right now in the courts that the White House is pursuing to try to take away protections for people with pre-existing conditions. And I just find that appalling. But this bill, on top of all of what I've just said, would add another $60 billion to the deficit. And we're considering this on a day when we've learned that the deficit is exploding out of control. According to CBO, that's in large part because of the tax cut bill that you guys passed that benefits mostly the wealthy in this country. But we do know that this bill has virtually no chance in the Senate. So I'm crossing my fingers that there will be a change around here in the next session so that we can actually consider bills to help people rather than ones that would take their health care away. You know, I'm not going to prolong this hearing, and I'm not going to have any questions. So I, again, thank our witnesses for being here, and I will yield back our time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We're delighted that both of you dialogue that the distinguished gentleman and I and other committee members have about the actual effect of what might be called the Affordable Care Act And of course, as Mr. Kelly knows, that we had testimony in here from other members who said, yes, when members of Congress got on Obamacare, it doubled the amount of money that our insurance was costing us and doubled the deductible. And that is a destructive force that's seen all across the country. Twice as many people almost pay the penalty than take Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. So this $60 billion would have come out of people's pockets to pay for the Affordable Care Act. So we'll continue to debate this. Mr. O'Kelly, we're delighted that you're here. Mr. Levin, we're delighted that you're here. Without objection, anything you have in writing today will be in the record. Mr. O'Kelly, I understand that you will be leaving perhaps a little bit early, and the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Black, would take your place if, in fact, that happens. So we'll just notify the committee of that. So we'll do that. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Sessions, Ranking Member McGovern, members of the Rules Committee, thank you for allowing me to testify in support of this important bill. I'm here to discuss H.R. 3798, the Save American Workers Act of 2018. The Ways and Means Committee and I have been particularly concerned with how this law has negatively affected the employer health insurance market. Over 175 million Americans receive health insurance through their employer. Obamacare's government intrusion into the employer-employee relationship through the employer mandate to offer government-approved health coverage and other tax increases has increased costs and administrative burdens for employers. These costs are ultimately passed on to employees and consumers through higher prices, lower wages, and fewer hours. This common-sense bill before you today contains 5 provisions. First, it changes Obamacare's definition of a full-time employee. Currently, Obamacare defines a full-time worker as those who work an average of 30 hours per week, rather than the traditional 40-hour work week. This provides an incentive for employers to keep or reduce hours for their part-time workers below that threshold. This nonsensical and rigid definition limits workers' ability to work more hours, and it also subjects a greater number of employers to the employer mandate. This provision redefines full-time employee as working an average of 40 hours per week or 174 hours per month. Second, this bill delays the Cadillac tax until 2023. As everyone knows, I've been very vocal in opposing this misguided tax that hangs over the head of the 175 million Americans who receive health insurance through their employer. Postponing this punitive excise tax will give employers and employees who are facing increased costs or decreased benefits an additional year of relief. In fact, this is an issue that unites both Republicans and Democrats. I'm pleased that this issue remains a priority for the committee and the House, as seen by this common-sense approach, similar to other Affordable Care Act tax delays enacted earlier this year. But we cannot lose sight of our goal to fully repeal the Cadillac tax. Third, the bill grants retroactive relief from the employer mandate from 2015 to 2018. The employer mandate was originally supposed to take effect in 2014, but the Obama administration never enforced it. Obamacare explicitly requires exchanges to send a notice before the IRS can assess a penalty tax. Even though many employers did not receive these notices over the past 3 years, the IRS began collecting tax penalties from certain employers in November of 2017. This retroactive enforcement seemingly runs afoul of the law and places an immense burden on employers. This bill imposes a retroactive moratorium on the mandate. This means that any employer that owes a penalty for failing to provide the right government-mandated coverage during this period would no longer owe it. There are employers in my district and across the nation that are faced with hundreds of thousands of dollars in penalties and compliance costs that they simply cannot afford. Fourth, this bill repeals the 10% excise tax levied by Obamacare on indoor tanning services that has resulted in increased costs and fewer jobs. My good friend and colleague, George Holding, has been a great champion on this issue, and I'm glad to see it included in this package. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, this bill contains a provision that I introduced with Mrs. Black and Mr. Thompson to reduce unnecessary paperwork. Originally introduced as Health Coverage Reporting Paperwork Reduction Act, this provision removes an ACA requirement that certain providers of health coverage, namely insurers and self-insured employers, send statements to individuals regarding their health coverage. These statements are used to prove that individuals are in compliance with the individual mandate, but are no longer necessary now that the mandate penalty has been repealed. This will save insurers and certain small businesses time and money on compliance costs. I want to thank Chairman Brady and Chairman Roscom on their dedication to bring this important employer relief package to the floor.
Mr. O'Kelly, thank you very much. Mr. Levin, welcome to the Rules Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, we're going to be marking up another tax bill tomorrow, and my colleagues are in meetings now on this subject. I mention it because I may want to go back to those discussions, but also because it's going to add hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars to the debt, and this bill itself would add $60 billion. There are other reasons to oppose it. I think perhaps the major one relates to changing the threshold from 30 to 40. We've been arguing about this for some time, and it's sometimes said that this will prevent employers from shifting workers to part-time status. But really, it's going to have the opposite effect. A CBO estimate is that a similar proposal meant that about 1 million Americans would lose their employer-sponsored coverage as a result. There would be a tendency of employers to shift people down from their present work level so that they would not have to cover them. And that's the basis for the CBO estimate that about 1 million Americans would lose their employer-sponsored coverage as a result. And so to bring up this bill at this time, as the ranking member said, it isn't going anywhere. If it's brought up on the floor of the House, it isn't going to pass the Senate. So why do it? Why do it, especially when the basic issues relating to ACA have really not been addressed by the Republican majority? For example, in October, the administration ended the cost-sharing reduction subsidies. It led to premium spikes. You mentioned premium spikes, Mr. Chairman. One of the reasons is the ending of cost-sharing reduction subsidies. This House majority has failed to take up that issue at all, not even holding a hearing on it. In June of this year, the administration decided to expand the reach of junk insurance policies. They would very much weaken consumer protections. Again, instead of this legislation that's going nowhere, the majority should have allowed us to have a discussion of this administration policy. A third example relates to the navigator provisions, and I've seen this firsthand in Michigan. The administration dramatically slashed the funding for entities. Most of them, I think all of them, are NGOs, having a variety of roots in their communities, helping them outreach to people so that they could learn more about ACA. This body has failed to really say a whimper about this, except for us on the Democratic side. And most importantly, as you know, I think the last week the court heard the Texas versus U.S. Lawsuit. And if a court holds and the administration failed to support the government, the action of the government, over 100 million people could lose coverage for pre-existing conditions. Despite the language that you claim would prevent that, I think it's virtually unavoidable if the federal court were to hold in favor of the lawsuit that millions and millions of people would lose their coverage for pre-existing conditions. So I think you're going to pass this out of the Rules Committee. I don't know what the plan is for the floor, but it would cost $60 billion. The lowering the threshold for the employer mandate would cost $18.6 billion. Eliminating the penalties, which I think is just a gift to a lot of people, would cost $25.9 billion. And the others, when you add them all together, reach $60 billion added to the deficit. In addition to Tax Bill 2.0, which is really, I think, digging a hole even deeper, which would cost 10 times that, if not more. So for all these reasons, I appreciate the opportunity to be here as the rest of the people on Ways and Means on the Democratic side are getting ready for the markup tomorrow. I would urge you to take a second look before you report this bill out. Thank you for once again hearing me. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I'd also like, so that the distinguished gentleman from Butler, Pennsylvania is aware, the administration has put out of the Executive Office of the President of the United States, of OMB, what's called a SAP, Statement of Administrative Policy, and the last sentence says, if H.R. 3798 were presented to the President in its current form, his advisors would recommend that he sign the bill into law. Mr. O'Kelly, thank you for working diligently for a piece of legislation that can be signed into law by us doing this. So without objection, I'm going to enter that into the record on behalf of the hearing today from the OMB. Mr. O'Kelly, we heard about the $60 billion. That's what people are going to pay for. People are paying that fee today. Is that right?
Yeah, my understanding, and this is from being in the private sector my whole life, and understanding that anytime government talks about a cost to government, what they forget is what they've actually done is relieve the burden on hardworking American taxpayers, because we know that every single cent comes from people who pay taxes, or a government that borrows money in order to cover spending that they can't make on their own. So I got to tell you, it's hard when you've actually had to make payroll, and when you try to put together compensation packages that keep you in a position you can attract talent and retain talent. And I think sometimes, while government is well-intended, it's so much easier to spend other people's money than it is your own. And when you completely disrupt somebody's business model and say, well, listen, this is just the way it's going to be and there's nothing you can do about it, I think the American people responded very clearly about it. It is something we can do about it, and we did do about it, and we did things about it. Elections do make a difference, and there's reasons people get elected to office. This is one of the features that I ran on back in 2010, because it was so harmful. It was so harmful to employers and to the people that work with them, their associates. While some of the conversation says this was such a great piece of legislation, the reality of it was it's not a great piece of legislation. Only government would come up with the idea that this is a great piece of legislation, especially when somebody else is picking up the tab on it. So I've got to tell you, the pieces that are included in here are just common sense ways that you run a sustainable business model. This is not pie in the sky thinking. This isn't off of somebody's laptop. This is off of somebody who actually has been on blacktop and understands what it takes to make a living and to stay in business. So a lot of these things, again, as we talked about earlier, I mean, every single piece we talked about, Chairman. Really, a 40-hour work week, that's not full-time employment? Why? A 30-hour work week has to be full-time employment. Why is that? Because we need the revenue. Filing all the the pieces that you have to. Say, why are we doing that when it's no longer in effect? Well, because you just have to. The Cadillac tax, and I got to tell you, if there's one thing that rankles organized labor, is the fact that something that was a generational fight for them, something that they put everything on the line to every time they went into negotiation, this was something that just made sense to those folks. Those are the people I grew up with. The blue-collar workers, the people whose main concern was taking care of their families and making sure that they were healthy enough to go to work every day and be able to carve out through negotiations, employer-sponsored health care. What a huge thing, and all of a sudden tell them, you're not entitled to this. It's just too damn generous for people like you. So I think there's been an awakening throughout the country, and people are looking at this very practically because it comes out of their hide. So listen, a lot of what we're going to talk about today goes back to whatever it is that we want to keep on kicking. But I would just suggest that this is a horse that ain't going to move, no matter how many times you kick it. We've got a lot of good things going on. This is one of them. And as an employer, make certain that 125 people have a paycheck every 2 weeks, sometimes not paying myself, depending on the business climate. I'm all in favor of making it easier for those folks to stay in business and to actually be able to navigate sometimes very difficult business climate.
Well, this is also part of that, what we were told would never happen, 4% GDP growth. It's
Right,
now
right,
4.2.
Yes.
What an opportunity to turn a corner. I guess the last point I'd make is, you were not here when this bill was signed into law. I understand that. You were soon to arrive as a result of this, however. But there was a piece that was an $80 billion piece of the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act package. That was called CLASS. And it wasn't long after, within a year or so after the bill was done, that people began understanding that was an $80 billion, literally, piece of fraud to get the bill signed into law that was never going to accomplish what we were told it was going to do. We repealed that pretty quickly. That was $80 billion. But that was fraudulent $80 billion that was never going to materialize. I think this is going to help people in their lives and with their businesses. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Chairman Cole?
Thank you very much, and I want to thank my friend for his legislation. I think these are incredibly commonsensical ideas that we define a 40-hour week as a full week, because that's the way we've done it for years. The idea that 30 with substitutes never made a lot of sense to me. And, I know there's all sorts of predictions that this bill will never become law. Well, we'll see. But I will guarantee you what I think will never become law, and that's the Cadillac tax. Because my friends wrote it into law, but they have voted every single time it's come up to extend it or avoid it. And if you believe in it, you should vote for it. It's a higher tax. It's literally taxing people for having insurance. And it hits tens of millions of families. Or you should develop another revenue stream that you're willing to support to be for it. And so, I think saying, with all due respect to my friend from Michigan, saying this is going to cost us money, it's money we're never going to collect because it's a law that's never going to happen. Because literally the people that support the overall Affordable Care Act literally don't support this provision of funding it. It was sort of a gimmicky deal when it got put in to try and make the numbers look better than they were. But again, when I see Democrats voting to tax people's health insurance, then I'll know they're serious about that particular provision. But every time I've seen it, there's been vast numbers of Democrats who voted not to tax the health care insurance of their own constituents. A smart vote, in my opinion, and the right vote. We shouldn't, tax people for a benefit that they've earned and that has historically been part of their package. So I just think it's, again, even if you believe in the Affordable Health Care Act, you need to find some other way to finance it than that, because it's just not going to ever become law. The reason why we're kicking it off, it's sort of like the doc fix, so I'll take credit. We did one of these ourselves, and we spent about 20 years until we finally bellied up to the bar and fixed it. So, and we did. It was a bipartisan compromise. Actually, improved the actuarial tables for the Medicare and Medicaid fund. So that was a good thing to do. Again, I just recommend to my friends, if you believe in the program, and I have no doubt you do, and I respect that. It's not where I would go, but I respect it. But you better find another, a piece of financing to replace that. Because again, I don't think whether you're in the majority or the minority, you'll ever get, this thing through the Congress of the United States. It's just not going to happen. Again, there's just too many Democrats that look on this as a flawed piece of legislation that they support in general, but they don't support this specific thing. So not a lot to debate here. We've seen this before, but I think it's important that we keep talking about it because I think highlighting it is important, and I think sooner or later, as my friend, the chairman, pointed out in the Class Act, people often argue that we didn't do any reforms afterwards. Actually, after the Affordable Health Care Act passed, there were like 7 or 8 different pieces of legislation which we passed and President Obama signed, and with Democratic support. All of us thought the 1099s were outrageous, and the Class Act was the biggest single, but there were literally 7 or 8 things that saved tens of billions of dollars that even my Democratic friends, on reflection, said, look, this is a big piece of legislation. Nothing ever is going to be perfect in a big piece of legislation. We're dealing with the tax legislation now in your committee, coming back, trying to fix some things that we think need fixing. So the same thing's true here, and that's probably one, eventually, the elimination of the Cadillac tax, where you can create a bipartisan consensus overnight. I commend you for doing this. This is one that I think even the authors of the bill, if they had to do over again, would probably reconsider. They'd probably find another funding mechanism. Might not be something I would support, but something that at least our own members would support. And in this case, Democrats don't support this, and I suspect we'll be voting in substantial numbers to make sure that we delay and at some point eliminate what's an incredibly regressive and unfair tax on people's health care. So with that, I yield back. Thank my friend for being, well, actually, if either of you care to make a comment, be more than happy to yield you time, but if not, I'll yield back my time.
Only from a standpoint of having actually been in a position where you really want to take care of the people you work with every day. And it's about mutual success for both the employer and the associate. When they both win, it's a win for everybody. And I just think this was so wrong-headed from the beginning. I know it was, there was a search for revenue. I get that. But I just think it's so egregious to take a look at something that was actually fought for. I mean, it's a generational fight and some of these folks to get the type of coverage they wanted for not only themselves, but for their families. And if it was such a good piece of legislation, there would have been a reason for the executive branch to enforce it. But to put it as part of a program, knowing that you're never going to enforce it in order to get to a final vote, I think that it's pretty plain to everybody. And I share your views, and I think I share the views of almost anybody. I'll tell you, this piece has so much support from our Democrat colleagues. And actually, the piece we're talking about, I think the actual birth of it took place with another member who came to me and said, listen, this is something that you and I both agree on and we can't go forward with. The only thing is I would ask you, please don't mention my name when it comes to the effort to repeal it completely. I really think it needs to be repealed completely. We're going to put it off for a while. The other thing I would just say, being a Cadillac dealer for many years, I wish everybody in America could drive a Cadillac, and I wish everybody could have the same plan. I would love to see that. I don't think that you can ever look at our fellow Americans and say, you know what, this is too darn generous for somebody like you. You don't deserve it. So I just think we've kicked this horse, as I said earlier, enough. I don't think it has.
I think if the authors of the original legislation had thought this was a really good idea, they would have implemented it immediately, not delayed its implementation past the next presidential election, and gave us plenty of opportunity, honestly, on both sides of the aisle, to find something else or to get rid of it. So just count me as skeptical this will ever come into force, because I think the politics of going home and telling your constituents, I just voted to tax your health care plan, are pretty daunting, no matter which party you're in or what side of the aisle you're coming from, what your point of view is. I just don't think the American people will tolerate that particular tax on their health care. So anyway, I think,
We're in total agreement on that, sir. Thank you, Mr. Cole.
yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGovern.
Yeah, I thank you. I'm not thrilled with the Cadillac tax either. I voted to eliminate it. But the difference is that, I believe we ought to find another pay-for. I'm happy to work in a bipartisan way with my Republican friends to find a pay-for to replace it. But the thing is, that's not what you're interested in. You're not interested in trying to mend and make the Affordable Care Act stronger and increase health care protections. You guys voted to repeal it outright and had no replacement. And now we see these continued attacks on protections for people with pre-existing conditions now being brought to the courts. So, I mean, look, the Affordable Care Act was not perfect. There needs to be fixes. And we should work in a bipartisan way to figure that out. But that has not been the attitude of the majority here, and I regret that very much. I think everybody in this country deserves good health care. I think health care ought to be viewed as a right and not a privilege in this country. But it seems that view is not shared, and I get it. So, look, I'm not surprised at all that the president sent a notice up here saying they would sign the bill into law. He wanted to eliminate the entire bill in its totality. And thank God for Republican Senator Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and the late Senator John McCain. Thanks to them over in the Senate, we avoided a major catastrophe. So we'll see what happens in the next election. I will tell you, if you're watching the election results, it seems that health care is a major issue. And what people are, why people are voting against Republicans is because they think they see you as taking their health care protections away. They don't want that. They want to improve the system. They want to make it better. And I believe we will do that if we're in charge. But anyway, I want to respect Mr. Kelly's time. I know he has to get out of here, so I will yield back mine.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Distinguished gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to give Mr. McGovern credit. The reason the American people think that that's what Republicans are doing is because the gentleman from Massachusetts tells the American people that's what Republicans are doing at every single Rules Committee hearing. I missed your testimony,
They get C-SPAN.
Mr. Kelly, and so I don't want to ask you a question about that. I just want to tell folks what they might not get to see, because I get to see you behind the closed doors when we're hashing out the toughest issues of public policy. And I've never once seen you do make a speech on behalf of a big corporation, stand up and fight on behalf of a multimillionaire. I see you roll up your sleeves and get in front of that microphone and fight for people every single day. Fight for families every single day. You and I came in the same class, and you are the same guy today that you were the first day you walked onto this floor, where you said, dadgummit, if only we work harder together, we can deliver for people things that are going to lift all boats and make everybody better. If folks were trying to pick a Republican that they could tar with the label of wanting to take away protections, wanting to hurt families, they picked the wrong guy when they picked Mike Kelly to come up here and testify. I wish the American people could see how hard folks fight when the cameras are off. I don't much care how much folks grandstand when the cameras are on. I care what folks are doing when there's an opportunity to push for change. And what makes it easy to support legislation that you're behind is you're always an advocate for people who have no advocate. You're always standing for folks who don't have the strength to stand for themselves. You always believe that we can do better together if only we'll roll up our sleeves and get to it. I want to thank you for that. I'm not going to see that television commercial on the air over the next 6 weeks, 8 weeks, but I have seen it in person, and I thank you for who you are and what you do in this conference and in this Congress. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Sounds like it's Mike O'Kelly Day at the Rules Committee. Mrs. Torres?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't here when they voted on the ACA either. I was a state legislator in California. In California, actually, we embraced the ACA, made it work for our families, and actually reduced premiums and ensure that we were on the street, knocking on doors, and giving people an option to either pay a fine if they didn't want to be a part of of an insurance plan or participate in an insurance plan. I think it's unfortunate. I'm not here to blame, you personally or any of my colleagues here, but I think it's unfortunate that we haven't had a very basic conversation. If you do believe that health care is a human right and not an option, and that we as Americans will not tolerate to have anyone fall ill and stay on the side of the road, that we actually call 911 and call for paramedics and take people to the emergency room and care for them and force our hospitals to take care of those people that are sick, that are ill, then it is a human right. And I think that when we have that conversation, then we could agree on a very basic principle, is how do we get there? Nothing is going to be free. I absolutely agree that there has to be a pay for everything. If you believe in organized labor, and you believe that, and you understand and believe that employees have, for many generations, as part of their labor agreements, have incorporated health care because they saw that not as an option, but as a human right for their families. They saw that as a way to take care of themselves and continue to be productive for their employers that they actually care for. When I talk to employers and employees in my district, they agree on one thing, is that they all want to get to the affordable part of health care. Employers want to be able to provide for their employees, and the employees understand that there is a share cost and that there is a mutual agreement that we must stay healthy in order to keep these plans low, and we must engage in more than just paying for a premium in order to keep the transparency and accountability part of it. It's also true that this, Congress and the Congress before that I have served on has voted, to completely repeal the Affordable Care Act, completely repeal, knowing that there was no signature on the bill. That was a safeguard, but that's just my opinion, right? Sometimes you take a political vote because it's convenient for your political career to get reelected, knowing that there is not going to be a real cost, a real pay for that your constituents will hold you accountable for. But elections do matter. You now have the White House. So you can't muster the votes to completely repeal the Affordable Care Act. So you've been doing it, one cut at a time. Passing this bill, passing that bill. The end game doesn't get us better health care. The end game is only making it harder for employers and employees to be able to access or provide the health care that they need. So it is disappointing, again, that we continue to have this back and forth and throwing political, back and forth at each other and rule books at each other, when in reality it's our constituents that are paying. They're ultimately paying for this. And that continue to see the rise in healthcare because we have not done our jobs. We have not dealt with the rising cost of medicine. We have not dealt now that that we have created an open space for junk insurance policies, pre-existing conditions. A large majority of my constituents have a pre-existing condition. One, they're a female, of childbearing age. That's a pre-existing condition. In my case, I have asthma. That's a pre-existing condition. I mean, all of these things add up to more costs for the folks that we want to take care of or pretend to want to take care of. I don't agree with this policy. I don't think that it gets us to the goal that we all want to get to. I'm disappointed that, again, we're adding more to the wall of debt that we already have, $58 billion over 10 years, on top of the $3 trillion that has already been increased to the deficit created by the tax cuts for corporations and billionaires. I mean, the deficit that we are running, in an attempt to justify cuts to critical programs that help the middle class, such as Medicare. All of these tax cuts for the wealthy are ultimately going to have a pay for. And the pay for is going to come at the cost of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. That's our seniors. Those are the people that, for years have negotiated contracts for a better life. This administration has already created more debt in 1 year that was generated in the first 200 years of America's existence. That's the legacy of this administration. So no wonder we're running scared for November. And I hope that we can have a more open conversation about healthcare and what our true beliefs are and what our goals are if we actually do want to get there to helping our constituents versus punishing them for being in a blue state or a red state. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back her time. The distinguished gentleman, also the subcommittee chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee on Health. Mike, tell me about that Medicare cut.
I don't think we should cut Medicare, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, the gentleman would
I
have that
actually wanted
opportunity.
to ask Mr. Kelly a question before he
Certainly, Doctor.
before he has to leave.
Gentleman, start your time.
Thank you. You gave a figure of 175 million people are covered in employer-sponsored insurance. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And this is the what often is referred to as the large group market or the ERISA market. Is that correct?
Correct.
It's been a sort of part of the background narrative for over 10 years that this part of insurance was going away, that it was going to disappear. In fact, that was one of the reasons given to us for the urgent passage of what's now known as the Affordable Care Act was employers wanted out of this business. They wanted nothing to do with providing health care for their employees. And yet, seems to me the numbers are increased this year over previous years. That probably is a result of the strength of the economy, I would suspect. But when people are taken into a employer-sponsored insurance, there is no issue of pre-existing conditions. Is that correct, Mr. Kelly?
That's correct. And we have been a staunch supporter of the fact that the pre-existing conditions don't really exist. We're not taking away that from anybody. And there's nothing that we've done that would even suggest that that's going to take place. So,
And I appreciate you for mentioning that. And if some court in some land took it away, I think that this Congress has shown repeatedly that it's willing to step up and provide what is necessary to protect people. We agree that we want people to have the protections for their illnesses, but the strongest protection you can provide is an economy that is producing the jobs, that provide the benefits. I mean, employers are having to compete to get employees right now, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah.
I don't understand why wages haven't gone up more than they have, but I'll take the fact that they increased a little bit, and they're offering more generous benefit packages to keep those employees home, to keep them from going and looking for greener pastures. Is that, am I off base there?
No, you're not off base at all. And we know that right now, for people that run a business and that own a business and they're trying to make their business more successful, we know it's a partnership between those that run the business and those that work for the business. And I would just say that I think it's hard to look and say that, well, if we're really only looking at the economy to grow 1.6 or 1.7%, and that's what it's going to be, and then all of a sudden it jumps to 4.2%, that completely disrupts all of the figuring that's been done. And so you start to say, no, wait a minute, that's not what's taking place here right now. Now, when it comes to talent, as you know, when you have a specific talent, and it's needed by more than one employer, you are in a market that's very strong for you. We are seeing wages rise, and I'm with you. I'm surprised they haven't risen more quickly, but I will just tell you right now, it is happening across our country right now. And I think that when you look at that opportunity that has been open for people, you know, listen, it hasn't been too long since we passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was just a little bit around last Christmas. And when you see what's happened in just about 8.5 months, you would say, my goodness, isn't this a wonderful thing that we've unshackled this economy and allowed it to rise to the potential that it truly has and not hold it back with heavy taxes and heavy regulations? It's just a matter of fact. And every measurable way that we can look at what's going on, there is win after win after win after win. And 2.0 is just going to add to that type of a projection going forward. And I just think that I think sometimes when you make a statement and you go so far down that road, you can't come back. You can't come back. So saying that pre-existing conditions, this is going to be taken away from people, that's just flat out not true. Not going to happen. There's anything we proposed that says that's going to take place. The other thing I would just say, Doctor, and you know this, listen, we are constantly in the private sector looking for talent. And there's an old adage out there. You pay a man or woman what they're worth, and then you give them a benefits package that shows how much you appreciate the fact that you're part of the same team, and you're striving for the same success, that's just common sense. You don't have to have a degree in economics to understand how this stuff works. This is the way it works in the real world every day. And I would just like to say, listen, I hear this back and forth, and listen, there's nobody that wants to see people more healthy than the people that actually employ them. The worst thing to happen to me is have somebody not be able to report for work that day, because I can't stand to lose their productivity. I can't stand to lose the fact that they're on the floor working and they're helping us be successful. So it is a mutual benefit for all. So I know you want to say something.
Not to mention the
But
time you
anyways,
spent in training that individual and the cost it would be
that's why we do
train
it.
their replacement.
That's why we do
I mean,
it.
that's the world I lived in when I ran my medical practice.
Mr. Burgess, would you just 30 seconds, not on this general discussion. I think November will decide the back and forth that you've had. 2 points. It's not correct that ACA was built on the elimination of employer-based insurance. As a young lawyer...
Sir, if I may interrupt for a moment, I recall those discussions very vividly. It was presented to us in committee hearings time after time that employer-sponsored insurance was an anachronism, it was a dinosaur,
Okay.
it was going away.
I don't know who told you that.
Gentlemen,
I chaired...
What's a co-op?
What's
A co-op was to compete
Mr.
for
Burgess,
exactly
could
what
I-
you're talking about, Mike.
Let me
Thank
just
you.
finish, though. 'Cause
Frank Pallone held the
I
hearing
chaired
the
Ways
same
and
day
Means.
that the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy occurred. That's how vividly I remember it.
Okay, I chaired the Ways and Means Committee when the ACA passed. That wasn't what was said within the Ways and Means Committee, and it wasn't the basis of ACA. ACA was based on a combination of public and private insurance. The private insurance was the employer-based insurance. Let me just finish quickly. As a young lawyer, I helped to set up numerous employer-based insurance policies in the building trades. A lot of them, our office wrote them. And in our discussion, the whole premise of ACA was to combine an employer-based system with a broader public sector system. And it's ironical that this bill that you are now apparently going to report out because of the change to 30 to 40, CBO says 1 million people are going to lose their employer-based insurance. That's what CBO says. So I don't understand the logic. And I just want to emphasize, when you describe
What was,
ACA...
just the jobs numbers were just reported last Friday. Was there a growth in the economy with the number of jobs produced?
Okay, I don't want to discuss November.
This is November. I'm talking about last week.
No, I know, but the public will decide on the back and forth that's
Are
going
jobs
there.
being created in the current environment is the question. And the answer is yes, they are.
Yeah,
Are
but
they
in
full-time
much
jobs?
less-
Yes, they are. They're 40-hour-a-week jobs. That's a good thing for people. Their wages are higher. We should rejoice in that.
But don't exaggerate like this president does. Grossly exaggerates what's been happening in terms of wages, grossly exaggerates what has happened in terms of job creation. The job creation started long before
Of
he
course
became the
it did.
president.
How could that have
Okay,
escaped
but let's do
my
that.
gaze? Sir, I will tell you this. You and I had a heated discussion last May or June about what's happening in the space of insurance premiums, and you brought it up again today. And I think it is important to point out that premium increases this year appear to be much lower than what you had predicted last May or last June. And I would simply submit it is the addition of the limited duration plans, the association health plans, which came online this month, and the elimination of the individual mandate has brought back some market sensitivity to the insurance market. And all in all, that's a good thing because it has brought premiums down. And that's what I'm asked about time after time is when are you going to do something to reduce the cost and complexity of the healthcare system? I don't care whether you call it ACA, Obamacare, or Trump care. I want the cost and complexity to come down.
Okay, but
I think this administration is making significant strides in that regard.
Well, tell them to reverse their position on cost-sharing reduction that insurance industry says has raised premiums. This administration has...
Again, that was the discussion we had last June. Our premiums, I don't know what they're going to do in Michigan, but I do know in Texas, the premium increases are under 5% in Blue Cross plans that are being sold this October.
Okay, so you should be a fan of ACA.
I never have. I don't know why I'd start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for once again letting us have this discussion.
Fine.
Okay? And I think the two of us need to leave. We're going to different meetings, I trust.
Well, I'm not sure the meeting you're going to, but I'm going on to a meeting with the 20th anniversary of something called the Hyundai Hope on Wheels program, where Hyundai dealers and Hyundai Motor America has been able to generate $145 million worth of money given to doctors fighting pediatric cancer and finding a cure for it. So we're both going to that. We're going to meetings. I don't know which one you're going to, but
Talk about
travel safe.
tax. Thanks.
Mr. Levin, do you,
I do have a
Mr.
request.
Levin,
But
do you
go ahead,
have
let's
any?
continue.
I have a
conversation.
request of the Ways and Means Committee. Could this Cadillac tax that you keep postponing, let's get rid of it so business owners can actually plan and do the right thing by their employees.
Well, Dr.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Doctor.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Levin, do you have anyone that would be taking your place when you plan to leave?
Mr.
Levin?
do you have anybody?
Okay. Gentleman may leave at his discretion.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Could I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record some letters, the AFL-CIO in opposition to the bill that we're dealing with here today? the
Without objection.
National Education Association, 47 organizations dedicated to harnessing every resource, scientific, financial, and educational, to fight against the scourge of cancer, or much of anti-cancer organizations, the American Academy of Dermatology, and AFSCME, all very much against.
Without
what we're
objection,
doing
those
here
will all
today.
be entered the record. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, we hope you thought you did well enough to come back, because we'd like you back the next time your number comes up.
I fully enjoy my appearances,
Well, we do too, as you can tell.
which have been innumerable.
Well, Mr. O'Kelly, do you intend?
I appreciate your courtesy. And I wish we had had this kind of vigorous debate all along. Sometimes, Mr. Cole, we're pals, you sound like an advocate of ACA reform. And I think
Mr. O'Kelly, do you want to stick around?
You know what, I'd love to stick around. I just, Ms. Torres made some very good points. I
Gentleman's
don't think
recognized.
it's ever been the case on either side of the aisle that we didn't want to see our fellow citizens receiving good health care. I also know that from a standpoint of being an employer who does offer employer-sponsored insurance, that we do it because it's critical. It's critical. I've never looked at that as a cost of doing business. I thought of it as a benefit of being in business, that you could actually offer this type of care to the people that you work with every day for mutual success. So I think sometimes we get wrapped around the axle in a lot of these debates and try to change what it is we're talking about. I would just tell you that the people on my side of the aisle want to see Americans healthy. They want to see Americans well taken care of. But you look at the 5 pieces we have. Ms. Black's here now because she has another piece. There's nothing in these 5 pieces that we're talking about today that in any way should be controversial. It just doesn't make sense to me. And I think if the idea is just to find a fight for the sake of having a fight, I would just hope that we look at the last couple of weeks in the Senate and say the American people deserve better than what they're seeing. It doesn't have to be a circus, but it should be a debate about what's in the best interest of the people that we all represent. I don't know how they're registered, by the way, and I don't know how they vote. I just know that I see their faces, and I know what their hopes and dreams are, and I know that at some point they are losing such faith and confidence in our form of government because they don't see it as being governing. They just don't see it that way anymore. It looks like it's a political circus out there, and it has nothing to do with policy. It all has to do with a political position. So I would just thank the committee for allowing me to be here today. Considering these 5 pieces that are included in this bill, every single one of them just makes sense. There's nothing in this that we've talked about that is in any way radical, in any way taking away from the health care of the people that we represent. So I'm gonna ask to please be excused to go to what I think is a very important gathering right now, the 20th anniversary of something that I find near and dear to me. And you know yourself, having children, and my wife and I were blessed with 4 children and 10 grandchildren. I can't look at the face of any child who's undergoing some of these terrible diseases and say, that's not my child. So I just hope we all look at this as what it is we're trying to get done. It all makes sense. Doctor, thank you so much for weighing in. And some of the figures, I just want to make sure we understand, there's nothing that we propose that takes away pre-existing conditions. It just doesn't exist. So I wish we could let's just tell it straight up the way it is and go forward. So I'm going to ask to be excused and turn over to gentlelady from Tennessee, good friend and good colleague, Ms. Black.
Mr. O'Kelly, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman.
Yes, sir. The distinguished gentleman from Alabama.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I got in here late, and I walked into it, and I thought I was hearing a different bill than the one I read before I got here. I thought the bill that we were dealing with, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Black, correct me on this, I thought this bill does 3 big things. Number one, it changes the definition of a full-time worker from being somebody who works 30-hour week to 40-hour week. Now, it does that, right? Now, in my district, if you go up and ask the average person on the week, what is the definition of full-time work, they say 40 hours. You know why they say that? Because they want to work a full-time job at 40 hours, and a lot of them in the recession were stuck less than 40 hours. By the way, they're rejoicing because they're now back to full-time at 40 hours. But we're just taking the same definition that our constituents have in their heads and putting it into law with that point.
That's correct.
And the second thing it does is that it basically does away with this employer mandate by taking away the penalty from them. I have heard nothing but complaints about that from employers, and here's what I hear from employers. They tell me, I'd like to grow my business. I need to grow it above 50, but I'm scared to. So it's been like a holdback on what people would normally be doing to grow their businesses. So that seems pretty common sense. And then the third big thing it does is it essentially does away with the Cadillac tax that the unions were all against. And I just heard Mr. McGovern tell us that the AFL-CIO is against the bill. Well, they kept telling me the last several years they wanted us to repeal the Cadillac tax, and that's what this bill does. Is that right?
That's correct.
Well, gosh, then I did read the bill right. It just when I came in the discussion, walked in the door, people were talking about a different bill. I thought when Liz walked in the door, I thought this was a bill that did away with protections for pre-existing conditions and all that. And that turned out just not to be correct. And I'm glad to know that I read it right. Now, I did hear a discussion about something about pay for, and I worry about pay fors. Let me tell you one of the one pay fors it can't be under this bill is Social Security and Medicare. Because Social Security and Medicare is mandatory spending. We can't take that money out of that unless for some reason you could find enough people around here to vote to change the mandatory status of Social Security and Medicare, which I've only been around here 5 years, but one thing I know, that ain't happening. So Social Security and Medicare is not going to be hurt by whatever deficits we're creating. Now, I did note that the deficit in the second year of President Trump is far less than the deficit in the second year of President Obama. I think that's true, too. So while these deficits are real and a problem, we need to deal with them. We're not going to deal with them by doing something about Social Security and Medicare. That isn't happening. I'm just enough of a realist to understand that. But by golly, we got to do something about the deficits, and that means we got to do something about spending. And there's a lot of mandatory spending that's not Social Security, it's not Medicare. In fact, there's $1.2 trillion in mandatory spending that's not Medicare and not Social Security. Maybe we ought to change the status of that and start doing our job as congressmen, start making the hard choices to deal with the deficit. But this bill is not going to take money out of Social Security or Medicare. This bill is not going to change people's pre-existing condition status under the law. This bill is going to do some common sense things that our constituents expect us to do. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Distinguished gentlewoman from Wyoming.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman. I just want to associate myself with comments of my colleague from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
Thank you very much. Did the other member wish to engage the distinguished gentlewoman from Tennessee? Seeing none, Diane, I want to thank you. Your timing was impeccable.
I think this was my easiest time in here ever.
Well,
This was
it's-
great.
You're right.
You all
it won't
made
get
all my
easier.
points. It was great. And I certainly want to associate with the gentleman's comments from Alabama related to our spending. And as the former budget chair, you are right. If we don't deal with that at some point in time, we're going to be in real big trouble, and we won't have any money left to pay Social Security or Medicare. So I appreciate those comments. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very
Chairman.
much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, gentlemen. If you brought anything that was in writing that you'd like to leave for Austin Stenographer as one of our witnesses, you would be entitled to do that. So thank you very,
Thank you, Mr.
very
Chairman.
much. Okay, is there any other member that would seek time to discuss this bill that is directly before us, H.R. 3798? Seeing none, this now closes the hearing portion, and we are going to, we're going to go ahead and take a recess, and I'm going to read from the paper here because evidently we are aware that the Senate began voting at 6 o'clock, which was about 8 minutes ago. So the Appropriations Conference report is somewhere in that viewpoint that they're going to be doing in the voting over the next few hours, and we're hoping that the Appropriations Conference report will pop out and that we can get the paperwork here and that we can then get back together. So I'd like to say maybe by 7:30. If it's not at a time that we could be back by 7:30, in other words, immediately after or soon after the last votes that would be on the floor, then I'm going to postpone that till a little bit later, probably around 9 o'clock. So if we're not on at 7:30, which we'll advise you, then we would come back at approximately 9 o'clock p.m. So, subject to call, is there any questions? Subject to call the chair. We've received our instructions. Rules Committee come to order, and thank you very much for allowing us to have this quick delay. I appreciate the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts coming back. Yes, sir. By the way, Mr. McGovern, I'd like to introduce my son, William Sessions, who's back over there. Bill is a senior at Texas Tech University Medical School, 4th year, and he is uptaking a rotation at Georgetown Medical School for this month, and then he graduates May the 17th, and before that, he gets married May the 4th. Yeah. So it's good having him here. Thank you very much, Bill. Delighted that you're with us. Okay, what we're going to do now is go through one rule, two bills. H.R. 3798, Save the American Workers Act of 2017, and H.R. 5895, which is VA Milcon, Energy and Water, and Ledge Branch. And then we're going to have, as the gentleman knows, tools for the district work period and the period of time that we will be back home. So, Chairman, now be interested in a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 3798, the Save American Workers Act of 2017, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-84 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides for consideration of the conference report to accompany H.R. 5895, the Energy and Water Legislative Branch and Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Appropriations Act of 2019. The rule waives all points of order against the conference report and against its consideration. The rule provides that the conference report shall be considered as read. The rule provides that the previous question shall be considered as ordered without intervention of any motion except 1 hour of debate and one motion to recommit if applicable. Section 3 of the rule provides that on any legislative day during the period from September 17, 2018 through September 24, 2018, the journal of the proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved, and the chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and a time to be announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. Section 4 of the rule provides that the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 3. Finally, Section 5 of the rule provides that each day during the period addressed by Section 3 of the resolution shall not constitute a legislative day for purposes of Clause 7 of Rule 13.
I want to thank gentlemen. You've now heard a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Georgia. Is there amendment or discussion to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say for the record that we support the minibus, and, if that were brought before us separately, we would have happily voted for it, voted for a rule for its consideration. But it's attached to the record-breaking 97th totally closed rule, so we have to oppose it. So
Okay.
I have no amendments, and I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. No amendment, so the vote will now be on the motion from the distinguished gentleman from Georgia. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Accordingly, I will be handling this for Republicans.
Mr. Hastings of Florida will handle for Democrats.
Judge Hastings will be handling this for the Democrats. Is there any other business before the committee? I want to thank you for coming back and appreciate the detail, including the staff that was here with us, staying late, and to my son, Bill Sessions, thank you very much for taking time to be with us. This concludes our work for the day. Okay, there's that.